All set. Okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for coming along to this session this afternoon. I'm Innes Miller. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for a company called Staffmetrix. We've been going for a couple of years, and we specialise in data analytics around gender pay gap reporting and diversity and inclusion. I think it's fair to say that it's really not that often that we see a piece of regulation that attracts the attention of such a broad range of stakeholders, but I think that's something that can certainly be said of the gender pay gap reporting, and I've sort of really tried to have a think myself about what else has actually sort of hit the headlines on more occasions, and I was trying to find some stats around this yesterday, but was unable to. But I think that probably about the only one that outstrips it is Brexit. So I think that the media have certainly done a fantastic job in actually raising awareness of what gender pay gap reporting is and why it's important for companies and organisations out there to take it seriously. This afternoon, what I would like to do is to talk to you really sort of about what I describe as being the macro view. So looking at gender pay gap reporting from a sort of a fairly high level. I'm not going to sort of get into too much kind of detail around the stats and the analysis, etc. Have a look at some of the criticisms that have been made, because there are some shortcomings with the legislation. Look at some more of the strategic issues and some of the things that organisations need to think about, really from a brand and from an operational and a risk management perspective, to ensure that they are actually embracing the regulations and the requirements in the right way. So in terms of the points that I will go through, I'll just give you a little bit more on Staffmetrix in a minute. Talk to you about some of the government aims to make sure that we've got the context around this, and then look at the response that we've had from organisations and from the media. I think it's also important to look at the methodology and really to sort of try and understand some of the criticisms that have been levelled at it. It's not perfect, but I think we can all broadly say that it has actually achieved its aims, which is good. We'll take a look at some of the numbers. We did hear this morning that there still are some organisations out there that have reported some improbable data, and yeah, I'll show you a few of these, and yeah, some of the numbers are quite stark, shall we say. And then from there, have a think about the stakeholder implications. So what does it all mean from a stakeholder perspective? And there is actually quite a broad group, both internally and also externally. Where do we go from here? So what's next? We did sort of get a bit of a clue this morning around the whole kind of ethnicity piece. And thereafter, just a point on timing and around the time it is going to take to change and for us to see genuine results around this. So just to give you a bit of background to Staffmetrix, we're based in Edinburgh. We're workforce data analytics specialists. We've developed our own analytics platform that's designed to help organisations understand and improve their diversity and inclusion performance. And the clients that we work with are primarily within the world of financial services, professional services and education. We've also been working closely with media organisations to help them understand gender pay gap reporting and its implications. And some of these are at the bottom there: Financial Times, BBC, Channel 4 and also CNN. Off the back of that, we then decided to, because we've seen so much demand and interest around the data, off the back of that, we then decided to create our own standalone website, which is called genderpaygap.co.uk. And I will be, sorry, it's genderpaygap.uk, and I will be using some of the numbers from the website today to look at actually, how companies have been reporting, but I'm not going to try and attempt to do it live, knowing how much of a risk is involved in technology. We're also working on a methodology to help organisations improve their overall business performance by creating a more diverse and inclusive workforce. And our vision and all of this is very much threefold, and that is that through data and measurement, we want to be able to work with employers to create more progressive and better balanced environments that are valued more highly by everybody in the organisation. We also want to be able to improve transparency and also improve accountability as well. So just thinking about the government aims in all of this, I thought it might help just actually sort of recap on the context of the legislation and think about what it's actually been designed to achieve. And we've sort of put it into sort of 6 kind of key themes here. First of all, we have to remember that, okay, gender pay gap reporting might not be perfect, but it is a starting point. And the government had to create something that's not overly complex for organisations to complete, even although there is complexity in the requirements. And even although, based on some of the data that we've seen submitted, there are organisations out there that certainly have found it quite complex. And in some cases, there have been some fairly significant assumptions that have been made. So the government wanted to maximise participation by limiting the requirement to 6 key metrics. There had been more calls for more detailed data to be published, but this would also be expensive for organisations to prepare and expensive for the government to police. So there's a point on practicalities around all of this too. We also have to bear in mind that the government already have access to pay gap data from the ONS, but this is also about ensuring that firms understand and take responsibility for their own positions. So the government, yes, they've got the data, they could have reported, but they want organisations themselves to actually sit back, have a think, understand where they currently are, and then think about what they then need to do to change. The legislation has been designed to encourage greater transparency and accountability, question mark around transparency, and absolutely, take that point. Is it truly transparent? No, it's not. We've got some more work to do on that. But for many, I think, producing the data has been uncomfortable, and it's certainly led to, in some and perhaps many cases, organisations realising that they've not been effective at supporting women through their careers as perhaps they should have been. So I think there are a number of organisations out there that I can think of, especially within financial services, who do make great attempts, through the training development that they have in place within their organisations to try and help the career progression of females. But actually, when you look at the numbers, there's a significant difference, and they do have quite big gender pay gaps. So clearly, more work to be done. Importantly, the point on reflection. It has created an opportunity for organisations to have a conversation within themselves among management. And this has led to reflections on what organisations must do and what they need to think about to create and provide equal opportunities for all. And I think that is a key point that's actually been missed throughout all of the the media and the press coverage, is that it's not just about women. Actually, this is about men and women, and it is about creating better working environments for everyone. And it's about removing barriers to progression. Undoubtedly, the legislation has raised awareness of the fact that women find themselves at a disadvantage when they reach a certain level in an organisation. And the reasons for that, sadly, I think in a lot of companies are just generally accepted, with management unconsciously believing that that might be okay. If we have a look here at the levels of participation, female participation in the workplace, we can see that when we actually look at the lower quartile there, the number is around 56%, but when we get up to the top quartile, it drops down to 37%. So that's a difference of around 20% and a drop of 30%. So it's quite significant. So I think we can begin to see the amount of work that has to be done. Finally, the legislation has been designed to encourage firms to take action. There's broad acceptance that the status quo cannot continue and that things must change. With the numbers being published each year, over time we will be able to build a picture of who is successfully changing and who is not. And there will be significant implications for those who are not changing, and I'll come on to these later. However, we are hearing that some boards, through all of this, just within the last kind of couple of weeks, have actually become a bit kind of fatigued with gender pay gap reporting. They now want to move on and think about, Brexit and perhaps other bigger issues within their business. I think a point for everyone really is around, so actually how can momentum continue? How can that be achieved? And certainly the media will continue to have a very big part to play in all of that. So in terms of the response, what have we seen? Well, there has been strong interest in this from around the world. A number of other countries that maybe already have legislation in place or are thinking about doing so have been watching with interest to see how successful this exercise would be. In the weeks running up to the deadline, we saw huge interest in the results as they came in, and apparently the gov.uk website was receiving almost 50,000 hits per day. So I guess for some people it was perhaps more exciting than the Eurovision Song Contest. The media interest as well has been intense. However, it has to be said that while the media has done a great job in raising interest and raising awareness, the issue has been sensationalised and it has caused confusion, not least blurring the lines, as we heard this morning, between equal pay and the gender pay gap. The BBC case is perhaps the best example of this, and it led to issues in other organisations where employers became fearful over equal pay claims and the impact on morale. Many employers actually delayed publishing their reports because they wanted to be clear on their position should any legal claims arise. And also, for the first time in many years, remuneration was being openly discussed among employees and on social media within organisations. So even although the response rate was only 80% at the reporting deadline, I think it was probably more than many of us would have perhaps expected, especially 4 weeks to go. There were only around 4,000 organisations, or around a third of the total, that had actually reported. And I suspect that at that point, the government was probably actually feeling, quite nervous about where things might actually end up. The HRC did also come in for some criticism, many believing that it will be ineffective and toothless in their efforts to penalise those who had failed to report. And you heard this morning, obviously, from Joanna in terms of the process that organisations will go through. And I think it's very positive to hear that it sounds like that not too many of them will end up being fined. I think the other point that she made around improbable data perhaps is going to be the more interesting area to watch once they start actually drilling down into some of the numbers. And I might have some candidates for her to have a look at just shortly. It's also worth noting that since the deadline, 586 companies have actually submitted the reports, and this was at last Friday when I submitted the slides. Okay, so moving on, really just a quick kind of, recap on the numbers and the reporting outcomes. One thing to point out, actually, with our website that we've created, a separate standalone website, for some reason, the data that we get from the government website, we just take the CSV file. It doesn't actually reflect what's on the government website, so we're trying to kind of work out what's actually happening with the GEO in the background, but the data at times has been a bit kind of erratic. So as of last Friday, we'd seen that 10,512 organisations had reported, and that was split by 1,679 public sector and 8,335 public sector companies. The median gender pay gap overall is 11.8%, and the mean is 14.8%. So if we compare that to the ONS data from 2017, their estimated pay gap was 9.1% for full-time employees and 5.1% for part-time employees. The ASHE medium gender pay gap for all employees was 18.4%. However, the bonus gap is probably the bigger issue that needs to be addressed, and there is complexity that lies within this. However, it probably is a more kind of meaningful measure when we look at organisations on an individual basis, and perhaps a more accurate number. While the number of men and women that get paid a bonus is only a few percentage points apart, the median bonus gap stands at minus 20.4%. Now, the way that we've calculated this is to take the average of the median bonus gaps. However, that number has been skewed by a few outliers, which I will highlight shortly. And it's probably a good example of lies, damn lies, and statistics. So the methodology, is it flawed? I think anytime we look at numbers, it's important to understand how they have been derived and what the limitations are. And over the last few months, we have seen a number of criticisms levelled at the gender pay gap reporting methodology that do point to the fact that the reporting methodology is a bit of a blunt tool. However, our view is that it's been largely effective and it has broadly achieved its aims. To recognise the issues, I thought it might help to provide an overview of the comments that have been made. Initially, much of the data was misunderstood and misrepresented, and many journalists did not make clear enough distinctions between gender pay gap reporting and equal pay, and I think you're all sort of familiar with that. It was something, again, that was sort of talked about this morning. It was further complicated by what the numbers were actually telling us, i.e. the difference between the mean and the median. And having initially used the mean, Many in the media then switched to the median, recognising that it actually provided a more accurate picture of the gender pay gap within organisations. The most outspoken criticism, however, has come from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I don't know if any of you picked up on any of the comments that actually came through from them, who both on print and television made a number of comments. They said that the methodology wasn't actually fit for purpose. And Kate Andrews could not have made her message any clearer when she said, in her article, crude gender pay gap reporting measures render the results meaningless. Quite a strong statement. So in addition to the points that are on the slides here, there was other reasons that the IEA gave, and that were that it failed to provide any meaningful insight into equal or fair pay for men and women in the workplace. It required pay gaps to be measured across entire organisations rather than between comparable roles within organisations. So looking at what they were suggesting, it almost felt as if they were suggesting something that was more kind of akin to equal pay. And obviously that would have been quite costly for a lot of organisations, I think, to get into that. They also mentioned that the regulations incentivised organisations to not only hire more women into senior roles, but to hire fewer women into junior and lower paid roles to achieve the closest calculation a company can get to a 0% pay gap. Our view is very much that while these comments might be valid, we do have to recognise the practicalities and the limitations faced by both the organisations themselves and also the government. And we recognise that the government wanted to introduce a simpler approach to try and actually encourage as many organisations as possible to report. However, it's important that we don't take the methodology into consideration, that we do take these into consideration when analysing the data. So to come on and then just give you a quick overview of the numbers, and effectively what we've got here are the best and or the highest, or the sectors with the highest and the lowest median gender pay gaps. Construction, followed by financial, as Jana mentioned. Yeah, that's the on the median bonus gap. Yeah. However, if we look at the when we look at the median bonus gap by the highest and lowest individual organisations. Sorry, give me one moment. Yeah, it does actually throw up some very odd-looking numbers. Not least the negative bonus gap. So I don't know if you can actually read that from there, but there is one company, and they are a PLC. They're called Optare, and they submitted a median gender bonus gap of minus 120,695%. So this is where that when you start to sort of add all the numbers up and you start to look at overall median and averages, etc., they can actually be thrown out by some of these numbers. Now, I did actually contact Optare, and I said, I'm speaking at this conference this week, just quite curious to know how you got to this number. And as kind of expected, they came back and they said, well, actually, we can't really comment on it. It relates to employee confidentiality, but it is possible that there might have been a female in that organisation that was given a very considerable bonus. Because they're a PLC, I also went through their annual report and accounts, but I couldn't actually find anything that kind of suggested that was the case. But I think it does give you a few examples there of just some fairly large numbers, and looking at them, you do kind of wonder, whether or not these are realistic numbers, whether or not somebody's actually misunderstood the legislation, or if they are entirely improbable. In terms of the actual reporting quality, we did see a number of issues with reports that had been submitted, and I have to say, I think Sarah Gordon at the Financial Times and Amelia Gentleman at The Guardian did a fine job in actually highlighting some of these improbabilities, and the teams there at the FT and The Guardian did a very good job of highlighting some of them. We saw zeros in all columns, no director sign-off or an equivalent, and I'll just give you some examples of these. So up at the top here, we've got a number of organisations that have just decided to submit zeros, and on the lower part of the slide there, we've got no links to reports and no named director. We We saw 22 companies with bonus gaps of more than 100%. We saw one example of a mean gender pay gap of more than 100%. We had organisations that submitted more than once because they got their numbers wrong. Hugo Boss was the one that the Financial Times highlighted, and they also very cleverly picked up, I don't know if you saw this, a week past on Sunday, it was on the FT website, there was also an article about Arriva that had submitted some improbable data relating to their pay bands. And when the Financial Times highlighted it to them, they actually went back and amended their numbers. So I think it does highlight that, you know, the media, some of these organisations, the press organisations, do have teams of data analysts. And companies should be alert to the fact that they've actually got some pretty smart statisticians working for them who can work out probabilities in their data. But as Joanna said this morning, I mean, it looks like we're going to see more. The same article in the FT also interestingly discovered that organisations that had submitted their data late were also more likely to have improbable data. Coming on to thinking about some of the risk implications here. So why does the quality of information submitted, you know, matter, and what happens if you get it wrong? Well, there are a number of risks that leadership teams need to be aware of. Firstly, there's the impact on current employees. It has resulted in salaries being much more openly discussed, and we are seeing organisations, or some organisations are seeing some fairly strong social media activity on the subject. Or certainly they were just after they'd submitted the reports. In some cases, it did impact employee morale, where employers had failed to adequately communicate the reasons behind why the gender pay gap report was what it was, and that the employees through this felt they were actually being shortchanged. And of course, we've also seen the equal pay claims that this morning were referenced to as well, such as the one that Tesco's facing, currently a $4 billion claim. Others are in progress at Asda, Sainsbury's and Morrison's. Unsurprisingly, the area has become a target for no-win, no-fee lawyers who really just you know, see this as a great opportunity. Interestingly, one thing on Tesco that I was hearing about, apparently because of this, and I'm going to come on and talk about the investment piece just shortly, but apparently Tesco were actually removed from a Morgan Stanley Composite Index because of this. So from an investment perspective, this is also beginning to have more of an impact. Prospective employees are also increasingly assessing the gender pay gap of organisations if they're looking to make a decision on who they actually want to go and work for. And that's got implications for organisations around how they actually attract the best talent and also their employer brand. And lastly, and as I've sort of mentioned, the media has also been very effective at highlighting poor gender pay gap performance in a number of organisations, something which is having implications for brand perceptions and also customer relationships. We're also seeing buyers and supply chain managers paying more attention. So Aviva, for example, a year past in February, wrote to their suppliers and said that they would expect them to have around 30% of females on the board. But I think that another area that is becoming quite interesting and where we're beginning to see some fairly small, but I think some significant change, is around what's actually happening in the investment community. And I'm quite sure that you will all have picked up over the last sort of few days, Dame Helena Morrissey, who works for Legal in General, has actually just launched a girl fund. And she got quite a bit of publicity in the press through that. But the year really started with Larry Fink, the BlackRock CEO, who sent a letter out to the CEOs of the world's largest organisations. And he said that from an investor perspective, he is now expecting them to demonstrate what their social purpose is within life. You know, it's no longer just about purely making money, and workplace diversity was a key part of that. We also saw McKinsey update their research that links diversity to business performance, and we saw some of that this morning. And more businesses are actually recognising that it's a strategic advantage to be gained by having a diverse workforce. I was speaking to a bank a few weeks ago, and they were telling me that they actually used to share data from a benchmarking perspective with their peers, but they've now decided to stop doing that because actually it's having such a positive impact on their business that they don't actually want to be giving away any secrets. From a gender pay gap reporting perspective, there have been a number of AGMs recently where questions have been raised. Schroders and HSBC both had questions put to their board about what they were going to do to address their gender pay gap. There was an organisation behind that called Share Action. We're seeing the same happening in the US, where 2 asset managers have been very successful in getting organisations to publish their gender pay gaps. One organisation called Arjuna Capital, who successfully convinced 6 large financial services companies, including Citi, to publish their gender pay gap reports. And then last week, there was a situation with CTW Capital, who challenged Amazon and why it was that everyone on their board was white and why 7 of the people on it were men. And CTW asked Amazon to implement a new selection procedures based on the Rooney Rule. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but basically it was something that was introduced in NFL. So if you've got an NFL team, then one of the things that you need to do is that you need to interview a minority candidate if you've got any open roles for head coach or general manager within the team. Now, the interesting thing about Amazon was that they initially refused. They said, no, actually, the processes that we've got in place have been very, very finely tuned, and we believe that they are right for our business. However, interestingly, a few days later, they came back and said, no, we will actually change. So they have now changed their board selection policy. So with all of that, where do we then go from here? So right now, the focus is very much on gender pay gap reporting. However, it's possible that at some point in the future, it might be extended to include other characteristics such as ethnicity, disability, and perhaps even social mobility. With GDPR coming in, there is a bit of a challenge around some of these areas, and it's perhaps going to be a little bit less straightforward. But it might be worth mentioning that we have been working with a small number of clients that are actually looking at how they can improve the quality of data around the ethnic profile of their workforce and really trying to get a much better kind of understanding of it. But where an employer's not got a lot of trust with their employees and they start to ask them very personal questions around this, it is going to be quite difficult, or it could be quite difficult for them to obtain the necessary data. The reporting has other implications. So if you think about the quality of the detail of a report, that sends a clear message about your brand and your purpose. So is this a company that cares and has taken time to explain what is actually happening, or is this simply a compliance exercise? And we have seen quite a contrast in the quality of reports out there. Seen a number of one-pagers produced on Word, PDF'd, submitted to the government. We have seen others like Aldermore Bank, for example, SSE. I think there are plenty of good examples out there that maybe run to 12, 15 pages where a lot more detail has been provided. And that sends out a very kind of different message around your brand. There's also the point around your ability to attract and retain the best talent. And as I mentioned, prospective employees are now looking ever more closely at things like gender pay gap performance to get a feel for their chances of progression as a female in an organisation. If the chances look low, then the prospect might not apply. I think the quality of the report can also perhaps give a clue on governance and how seriously an organisation takes it. As mentioned, investors are increasingly paying attention, and in some cases it could determine whether or not a company receives investment. So some of these points need to be considered and addressed to ensure that an organisation is very much on the front foot and is tackling its gender pay gap in an honest and transparent way. Management do need to be willing to invest in measuring change on an ongoing basis and implement systems to track where improvements are being made and where more needs to be done. We do find that a number of the companies that we've been working with, they are just sort of focused at the moment on, yeah, okay, well, let's just get the number submitted. But actually, it is about looking down below to really understand, so where and why do we have a gender pay gap? What can we do to change it? Do we want to implement any targets within the organisation to help us? So these conversations are ongoing at the moment. But by embracing gender pay gap reporting in the right way, organisations will be able to and can derive a competitive advantage in the marketplace by making themselves more attractive to key stakeholders. So just before I wrap up, just a point on timing that was also touched upon this morning. So if we have a think about it, so by the 29th of March this year, only around 30% of organisations had reported, and that was 4 weeks before the deadline and the next snapshot date. So if organisations are leaving the reporting so late when they get round to, for this year, it probably means that over the period, little or no progress will have been made around how they're actually going to report on their gender pay gaps. So with this in mind, perhaps the best that we can hope for next year is not any significant difference, because I don't think that that will happen. But perhaps the best that we can hope for is improved data and reporting accuracy, better narrative, and more details on measurable action plans. And that is it. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions or any of the points that anybody would like to discuss, please let me know. Thank you.